Hello, friends. You know, in talking about avoidance and things like that, one of the things that I learned in grad school was something called the avoidance pattern. And again, this is something that we often learn it by observation, by participation in our family of origin. And in the process of the avoidance pattern, it's important to note that every time we escalate or do anything in the avoidance pattern, it increases the stress in that relationship. So if it's a relationship with a spouse or a friend or a sibling, or even our relationship with our physical and our spiritual self, it adds increased stress. So the very first piece of the avoidance pattern is something called the back out. And the back out is whatever we say or do that ends the conversation, but there's no solution. Fine, whatever, I have to go, yes dear, F you, like whatever the thing is that ends the conversation, but it doesn't actually resolve anything. That's the first stage of it. And we can do that, and it works for a minute. It relieves the tension, we get a break, and then we move on to the next one. And the next one is what's called numb out. And this is where we stop talking about it. This is where we just act like things are fine, because if I bring it up, it just starts a fight and it's not worth the hassle, and we just need to, move forward past that. And so we can do numb out. We'll pretend everything's fine and it's the elephant in the room kind of a situation. The third one is what's called slide out. And slide out is when we spend our time and energy doing things that nobody will say is a bad thing, but we're doing it with the express intention, whether it's conscious or not, to avoid the difficult situation. So for example, if there's conflict or stress in a marriage, maybe the husband stereotypically works overtime, or says yes to all the business trips, or spends as much time as we can outside of it. But no one will ever say, man, that guy, he's working too much, except for maybe the wife. But also it could be something where you're volunteering for a charity, or you're spending so much time with the community things, or you dedicate so much time to the kids you don't have time for your partner. Just little things that no one will ever say, oh, you're a terrible person for it. But it helps us to avoid whatever is going on. And a lot of times we shift between slide out and numb out, where like I'm not there, and then when I am there I pretend everything's okay, and we just never ever talk about stuff. And then the fourth one is called check out. And check out is where addiction lives, whether that's substances or food or video games or pornography or sex or anything, shopping, gambling. But it's also where suicidal ideation lives. It's also where infidelity lives, and it's also where unnecessary divorce lives. And so when you think about these escalations, every single time we increase to that level, it gets a little bit, worse, honestly. And again, if it's with ourselves, that might be just a separation from our authentic self, in the fact that we're so disconnected from ourselves and who we truly are. But paying attention to what are the things that are happening, and what are the things that I learned, and how do I unlearn them? I had a lot of people when I worked in treatment say, you know what, I'm the first addict in my family. And the reality is, probably not. There's probably been possible generations of the avoidance pattern modeled, but maybe the grandparents stopped at being a workaholic and being the best mom ever, and it never escalated to addiction or things like that because of their own tolerance, or value system, or accessibility, or whatever. But one of the hardest things about knowing the avoidance pattern, at least for me, is I have to be the one calling myself out on it. And it's still something that's hard to do differently. We all have lots of things we can be busy with that are noble, that nobody will say, oh man, you're a little bit too much in being productive, or you're a little bit too nice to your kids, or you're a little bit too hardworking in your life, or you've got a little too many hobbies, except for the person where there's distress. because we might get feedback from our partners that you're so busy you don't have time for me, when reality is we're avoiding something that we need to talk about. And so paying attention to and checking your street and saying, hey, oh yeah, this is the way I back out. Oh yeah, this is my go-to avoidance thing. What is the thing we do that's like, oh, this is noble, but don't talk to me. And being aware of what are those things that we do to distract ourselves from what we need to be dealing with, and how is that helping us? Sometimes the help is we're not ready to deal with the pain. Sometimes the help is we don't have to do scary things. But in the long run, it just gets worse. The longer we don't talk about things, the longer we don't address the issues in that, the harder it gets. And so I hope you can start noticing because you know what, there are healthy people out there. I just don't meet that many of them. But if you jump into the avoidance pattern at any point, we'll talk about and we'll get to how do we not do that? How do we do something different? What are the rules that help us? And what kinds of resolution do we have? I meet a lot of couples who don't know how to resolve conflict because they don't know how. They don't know, and it's scary. And the rules, and it gets unsafe and all kinds of things. So we'll get into that in the next few videos, but it's important to know, what are the things I do in that? And what does that look like? Does that look like a hobby that I get obsessed with? Does that look like prioritizing other things over my family? Does that look like staying so busy I don't have to think about my trauma? What does that look like, whether it's with myself or someone else? And maybe we can begin to get to some healing. Have a good day.